Hold the line, Drace. They're not bluffing. Commander Hyric's sharp warning cracked through the comms, underscored by the taut atmosphere of the negotiation chamber. Arian Drace's gaze didn't waver, his steel-blue eyes fixed on the Zindari delegation seated across the crystalline negotiation table. The alien emissary's bioluminescent skin flickered in shades of warning red, a silent language signaling their rising aggression. The room itself felt alive with tension, the air thick with a chemical undertone that stung the nostrils, a byproduct of the Zindari's advanced atmospheric tech. Arian leaned forward, his elbows resting on the glassy surface of the table. "Tell your captain to back down," he said, his tone cold and surgical. "You fire one shot at my ship, and I'll make sure your trade routes are blocked for the next 50 galactic cycles. See how well your people do when the Findir Consortium hears you lost Earth's trust." The Zindari envoy hissed, the sound akin to water boiling on hot metal. "Trust?" it sneered, mandibles clicking. "Trust is a leash, and Earth is not the master here." A low vibration ran through the floor, a signal that the Zindari fleet had just repositioned in orbit. Arian could feel the shift in gravity beneath his boots. It wasn't panic-inducing, but it was enough to remind him that his position in this galactic backwater station, Zikar Prime, was anything but secure. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, though he didn't flinch. The metallic tang of recycled air filled his lungs as he measured his response. "You've misunderstood me," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "Earth may not be your master, but we're not your prey either. Your fleet stays exactly where it is, or I send this deal into the void." The Zindari hesitated. Their flickering bioluminescence dulled as their leader conferred silently with its advisors. The faint glint of an unseen laser defense system swept the room, brushing briefly across Arian's face like the heat of a predator sizing up its prey. Hyric's voice came through the comm again, quieter now but tense. "Arian, we've got a ship inbound. Looks like a Zerion-class cruiser. No ID, no transponder. It's headed straight for us." Arian's jaw tightened. "Stall them. Give me 5 more minutes." He turned back to the Zindari envoy. "You're not the only one circling Earth," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "So ask yourself, do you want to be remembered as the race that worked with humanity, or the fools who picked the wrong side of history?" Before the envoy could respond, the station's emergency lights flickered, a deep, pulsating red that bathed the chamber in ominous shadows. A booming voice, mechanized and guttural, echoed over the station's comm system. "Attention, Zikar Prime. This station is now under the jurisdiction of the Clyrax Dominion. All unauthorized personnel will submit or face termination." The room plunged into chaos. Zindari soldiers reached for their weapons, their glowing armor casting streaks of eerie light across the walls. Arian's heart thudded in his chest as he activated his wrist module, calling up a tactical display of the station's layout. His breath was shallow now, tasting of metallic stress and recycled sweat. "What the hell is the Clyrax Dominion doing here?" he muttered, mostly to himself. "They don't care about the trade deal," Hyric said, his voice cutting back in. "They want Earth, and they brought backup." Arian's display filled with red markers, Clyrax warships dropping into orbit, their sleek serrated designs unmistakable. He could almost feel the faint reverberations of their weapons charging, an inaudible tension that pressed against his chest like an unspoken threat. "Envoy," Arian said sharply, turning back to the Zindari leader. "If you don't want to die here, you'll follow my lead. We need to get off this station." The Zindari hesitated, then nodded curtly. "You have a plan, human?" Arian smirked, though there was no humor in it. "I always have a plan. Whether it works is another matter." The group moved quickly through the station's winding corridors, the polished metal walls reflecting the strobing red emergency lights. The scent of burning circuitry and spilled coolant grew stronger as they approached the docking bay. Arian's pulse raced, but he forced himself to stay calm, his mind working like a hypercharged machine. He could hear the faint hum of distant gunfire. The Clyrax weren't wasting time. "Where's the Zerion-class cruiser now?" he asked Hyric. "Docked at Bay 7. They're unloading troops." "Perfect." Arian adjusted the strap on his tactical belt, his fingers brushing the smooth grip of his sidearm. "We'll take Bay 6. If they're busy with their invasion, they won't expect us to use their chaos against them." "Bold strategy," Hyrick said dryly. "Let's hope it doesn't get us all killed." The team reached the docking bay, its wide expanse filled with alien ships in various states of disrepair. The air was thick with the electric tang of plasma burns and the mechanical grind of automated loaders. Arian's eyes darted across the bay, quickly assessing their options. "There." He pointed to a sleek, Earth-built stealth transport tucked into the shadows of the far corner. Its matte black hull seemed to drink in the light, a ghost in the chaos. "That's our ride." As they moved toward the transport, a sharp metallic clang echoed behind them. Arian spun, his pulse spiking, to see a squad of Clyrax soldiers advancing through the bay. Their segmented armor glinted like obsidian knives, and their weapons emitted a low-pitched whine that made his teeth ache. "Get to the ship!" Arian barked, drawing his sidearm. He fired 3 quick shots, the weapon's recoil snapping against his palm. The plasma bolt struck the nearest soldier, sending a burst of molten sparks into the air. The rest of the squad returned fire, their weapons' blasts streaking past Arian in sizzling arcs. He ducked behind a cargo crate, the acrid smell of scorched metal filling his nose. "Hyrick, I need covering fire," he shouted. "On it!" Hyrick's rifle let out a thunderous roar as he unleashed a barrage of shots, forcing the Clyrax soldiers to take cover. Arian seized the opening, sprinting toward the transport with the Zindari envoy close behind. His boots thudded against the deck, each step a calculated risk as plasma fire rained around them. The heat singed his back, but he didn't stop. "Go! Go! Go!" he yelled as they reached the ship. The ramp hissed open and they scrambled aboard, the door sealing shut just as another volley of plasma fire struck the hull. Inside, the cockpit was a mess of blinking displays and flickering readouts, but Arian didn't hesitate. He slid into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the controls. The ship rumbled to life, its engines roaring as it lifted off the deck. "Destination?" Hyrick asked, his voice tight. Arian's jaw clenched. "Earth, but not yet. First, we're making a stop, because if the galaxy thinks Earth is weak, they're about to learn how wrong they are." The ship shot out of the docking bay, disappearing into the vast darkness of space. Behind them, Zikar Prime burned. The ship streaked through the void, its engines vibrating faintly beneath Arian's boots like the heartbeat of a restless predator. He leaned over the controls, his eyes scanning the holographic display projected in front of him. The cockpit was dim, illuminated only by the pale, shifting glow of starlight filtering through the reinforced viewport. Outside, space stretched endlessly, a cold and indifferent abyss, but the silence was short-lived. "Where are we going?" Hyrick's voice broke through the cabin, taut and skeptical. He stood behind Arian, gripping the overhead railing as the ship banked hard to starboard. His sharp, weathered features were drawn tight, and the scar running across his temple seemed to glint in the dim light like a jagged fault line threatening to crack under pressure. Arian didn't look away from the display. "If you can't figure it out, Hyrick, maybe you're not as sharp as you claim." "Stop dodging," Hyrick snapped. "You just dragged me out of a war zone. Now you're veering off course instead of heading to Earth. Start talking." Arian exhaled sharply, adjusting the trajectory with a flick of his wrist. His jaw was set, and his voice dropped to a quieter, deadlier tone. "We're going to Caros Station. There's someone there we need to talk to, someone who knows how to make the galaxy listen." "Caros?" Hyrick's disbelief hung thick in the air like the buildup of a storm. "You're joking. That place is a junkyard crawling with smugglers and bounty hunters. You'll get us all killed." Arian's lips curled into a grim smile, his eyes still fixed ahead. "Not if we move fast, and not if we find him first." Before Hyrick could argue further, the ship jolted violently, the sudden lurch slamming him into the railing. Sparks rained down from an overhead console as an alarm blared, its shrill tone slicing through the tense quiet. "What the—" Hyrick growled, pushing himself upright. "They found us," Arian said, his voice clipped. "Clyrax patrol ship. 2:00. The tactical display flared to life, showing a crimson marker closing in fast. Outside the viewport, The faint glimmer of a Clyrax cruiser appeared, its sleek, angular design like a blade slicing through the darkness. Its weapon systems powered up, the faint glow of charged plasma growing brighter as it prepared to fire. Hyric cursed under his breath. "They're not giving us time to breathe." "They won't, unless we take it from them," Arian replied. His fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision, activating the ship's countermeasures. The cabin filled with the low whine of energy shields coming online, a sound that sent a sharp jolt of urgency through Hyric's chest. The first blast hit a moment later, slamming into the shields with a force that rattled the entire ship. The impact sent a cascade of vibrations through the cockpit, the floor trembling like the bones of an animal caught in the jaws of a predator. Arian gritted his teeth, steering the ship into a tight barrel roll to evade the next shot. "Shields won't hold if we keep taking hits," Hyric said, bracing himself against the wall. "What's the plan?" Arian glanced back at him, his expression unreadable. "The plan? Don't die." Hyric groaned, but before he could respond, the ship's sensors pinged again. Another blast streaked past them, close enough to light up the cockpit with a brief, blinding flash. Arian's heart raced, each beat punctuated by the adrenaline surging through his veins. He pulled the ship into a sharp dive, aiming for the shadow of a nearby asteroid field. "Hold on," he barked, his voice taut with focus. The asteroid field loomed ahead, a dense labyrinth of jagged rock and spinning debris, illuminated faintly by the glow of a distant sun. The Clyrax cruiser followed, its weapons firing in quick, relentless bursts. The ship darted through the asteroids, weaving between massive hunks of spinning rock with terrifying precision. The sounds of the Clyrax plasma blasts echoed like distant thunder, sharp cracks reverberating through the cabin as stray shots struck nearby asteroids and sent fragments hurtling into the void. "Do you even know where you're going?" Hyric shouted, clutching the railing as another sharp turn threw him off balance. Arian's voice was steady, almost calm, though his knuckles were white against the controls. "Away from them. That's all that matters." But the Clyrax were relentless. The cruiser's engines burned brighter as it gained ground, its weapons targeting systems locking on. Another blast struck the ship's rear shields, sending a ripple of energy surging through the hull. Warning lights flared across the console, bathing Arian's face in flashes of red. "Shields at 30%, Hyric said, reading the display over Arian's shoulder. "We won't last another direct hit." "Then we won't give them one," Arian said through gritted teeth. He tapped a sequence into the console, diverting power from non-essential systems to the engines. The ship lurched forward, its speed increasing as it raced deeper into the asteroid field. Ahead, a particularly large asteroid loomed, its jagged surface pocked with craters and fissures. Arian's eyes narrowed as he adjusted their trajectory, angling the ship toward a narrow crevice that cut through the asteroid's center. It was a gamble, a move so risky it bordered on suicidal, but it was their only chance. "We're not going through that," Hyric said, his voice rising in alarm. "We are," Arian replied, his tone brooking no argument. "Brace yourself." The ship hurtled toward the crevice, the jagged walls of the asteroid rushing up to meet them. The cockpit was filled with the sharp whine of proximity alarms, their frantic tones matching the rapid pounding of Hyric's heart. The walls of the crevice were so close that sparks flew from the ship's wings as they scraped against the rock, the cabin shaking with each impact. Behind them, the Clyrax cruiser hesitated, its bulk too large to follow directly. It fired another volley, but the plasma blasts struck the asteroid's outer walls, sending chunks of rock tumbling into the void. Arian seized the moment, guiding the ship through the crevice with razor-sharp focus. Finally, the ship burst out the other side of the asteroid, emerging into open space. The Clyrax cruiser struggled to follow, its movement slowed by the debris field. Arian didn't wait to see if it would catch up. He punched the engines to full throttle, putting as much distance between them as possible. As the Clyrax marker on the tactical display grew fainter, Hyric let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned to Arian, his expression a mix of disbelief and grudging respect. "Remind me never to doubt you again," he said. Arian allowed himself a small, humorless smile. "I'll hold you to that." But his smile faded as he turned his attention back to the display. The Clyrax might have been momentarily shaken off, but the danger was far from over. Caros station awaited, and with it, the next step in their mission, a step that would bring them closer to the truth and to the storm brewing across the galaxy. "Strap in," he said, his voice low. "This is just the beginning." The ship sliced through the fabric of space, the stars stretching into silver streaks around them as Arian adjusted their trajectory toward Caros station. The cramped cockpit was alive with subdued tension, the glow of navigation displays painting his face in shades of blue and green. He could feel Hyric's gaze boring into the side of his head, but he ignored it, his focus locked on the silent countdown of their arrival. "How much longer?" Hyric finally asked, his tone sharp but tinged with unease. 10 minutes, Arian replied, his voice clipped. "Maybe less if the station's perimeter defenses don't target us first." Hyric let out a short, humorless laugh and leaned back against the cold bulkhead, the weight of their situation settling heavily between them. "Caros is a pit," he muttered, more to himself. "The kind of place where loyalty's worth less than a cracked fuel cell." Arian didn't respond, his mind already turning over the variables. Caros was dangerous, but danger wasn't new. The real challenge would be finding him, the one man who could tilt the scales in their favor. And if the Clarax had eyes on them, their window to move would be razor-thin. The ship shuddered as they dropped out of hyperspace, the sudden transition slamming the stars back into their proper places. Ahead, Caros Station loomed like a giant carcass of dead metal, its jagged structure glowing faintly against the backdrop of darkness. Its orbit was clogged with debris and scavenger ships, the distant flicker of welding torches revealing the constant, parasitic repairs that kept the station limping along. Hyric leaned over Arian's shoulder, his eyes narrowing. "They've upgraded security since I was last here. Automated turrets, tighter choke points. Looks like someone's expecting trouble." Arian tapped a control panel, sending an encrypted docking request to the station's system. The console beeped in acknowledgement, but not before a voice crackled through their comms, rough and static-filled. "Unidentified vessel, state your business or be vaporized." Arian keyed the comms, his voice measured and calm. "We're here to see Marvoc Tyrus. Tell him Arian Drace is calling in his marker." The silence that followed was weighted, broken only by the faint hiss of the static-laden connection. Finally, the voice returned, colder now. "Dock at Bay 7. Don't stray." As the ship maneuvered into the station, the docking clamps latched on with a resounding metallic clunk that reverberated through the hull. Arian rose from his seat, fastening the strap on his sidearm holster. His movements were deliberate, each motion a practiced rhythm of readiness. Hyric followed, loading his plasma rifle with a grim expression. The airlock hissed open, and they stepped into the station's docking bay. The atmosphere inside was thick with the unmistakable heat of overworked machinery and the faint tang of spilled coolant. Sparks flared as a repair drone zipped overhead, and the metallic grind of conveyor belts filled the air, punctuated by shouts of workers moving cargo. "Keep your head down," Arian said under his breath as they moved toward the checkpoint. The guards stationed there were Caros regulars, their mismatched armor and cybernetic enhancements giving them the appearance of scavengers playing soldier. They watched with suspicion as Arian and Hyric approached, their hands resting on their weapons. The lead guard, a towering figure with a cybernetic eye that glowed faintly red, stepped forward. "Weapons," he said flatly, holding out a gloved hand. Arian didn't flinch. "You want us to walk through Caros unarmed? Not going to happen." The guard's cybernetic eye whirred faintly as it scanned Arian lingering on his sidearm. "Rules are rules." "And exceptions are exceptions," Arian countered, his voice edged with quiet authority. "Unless you want to explain to Marvoc why his guest didn't make it past the checkpoint." The guard's lips curled into a snarl, but he stepped aside, waving them through. Arian caught Hyric's glance as they passed, a silent exchange that said everything. They were being watched. The corridors of Caros Station were a maze of rusted metal and flickering lights, the walls slick with condensation that carried the scent of grease and decay. Voices echoed faintly from unseen corners, snippets of arguments, laughter, and the occasional crash of something breaking. Every step felt like walking deeper into the belly of a beast, one misstep away from being swallowed whole. They reached a reinforced door at the end of the corridor, its surface scarred and pitted with age. Arian pressed a sequence into the control panel, and the door slid open with a heavy groan, revealing a dimly lit room filled with smoke and the low murmur of conversation. Marvoc Tyrus sat at the center, his massive frame draped in a patchwork cloak of alien fabric. His cybernetic arms gleamed in the faint light, and his eyes, one organic and one an unblinking orb of amber, locked onto Arian as they entered. Around him, a collection of unsavory characters lounged with weapons in easy reach, their expressions varying from bored to openly hostile. "Well, well," Marvoc rumbled, his voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "If it isn't Arian Drace, I was starting to think you'd finally found a job too dangerous for even your stubborn streak." Arian approached, his posture relaxed but his hand never straying far from his weapon. "Marvoc, always a pleasure." Marvoc barked a laugh, though it lacked any warmth. "Pleasure? You come here, dragging trouble in your wake, and call it a pleasure? Tell me, Drace, why shouldn't I throw you out the nearest airlock and save myself the headache?" Arian didn't blink. "Because I have information. Information you'll want." Marvoc leaned forward, his cybernetic arms whirring softly as he rested them on the table. "You've got my attention. For now." Arian reached into his jacket and placed a small data chip on the table. "This is a fragment of a Clyrax fleet command file. It outlines their invasion plans, their movements, and their real objective." Marvoc's amber eye flickered as he studied Arian. "And what exactly is their real objective?" Arian hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the room to feel it. Then he leaned in, his voice low. "Earth. They're not just invading, they're consolidating. Whatever they're planning, Earth is at the center of it." The room fell silent, the weight of Arian's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Marvoc's expression darkened, his organic eye narrowing. "And what do you want from me?" "Resources," Arian said simply. "Intel, access to your network. The Clyrax have already tried to kill me twice in the last 24 hours. I need to stay ahead of them." Marvoc leaned back, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. Then he smiled, a slow, predatory grin. "You've always been good at surviving, Drace. Let's see if you can keep it up." Before Arian could respond, the door behind them slammed open. A figure burst in, bloodied and panting, his face pale with fear. "Marvoc," he gasped. "The Clyrax, they've breached the station." Arian's hand flew to his sidearm as chaos erupted around them. Shouts rang out, and the sound of distant explosions reverberated through the walls. Marvoc rose to his feet, his cybernetic arms flexing. "Looks like your trouble followed you, Drace." Arian didn't waste a second. He turned to Hyric, his voice sharp. "Get to the ship, now." The station shuddered violently as another explosion rocked the lower levels. Arian grabbed the data chip from the table, his mind racing as he followed Hyric out the door and into the chaos beyond. Caros was under siege, and their window to escape was closing fast. Arian's boots pounded against the metallic floor of Caros station as the sound of distant explosions rippled through the corridors. Each blast sent shockwaves vibrating underfoot, dislodging fragments of rusted plating from the walls and ceiling. The station felt alive with chaos, a wounded beast lashing out in its final moments. The air was hot and oppressive, heavy with the metallic tang of scorched circuitry and the faint bitterness of burning coolant. "Move, Hyric," Arian barked, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. Behind him, Hyric stumbled but kept pace, clutching his plasma rifle tightly. The distant flicker of emergency lights danced across his grizzled features, casting sharp shadows that deepened the tension in his expression. "This place is falling apart," Hyric shouted over the distant cacophony of gunfire. "We're not making it out of here alive unless you've got some kind of miracle in your pocket." Arian didn't reply. He couldn't afford to waste breath on anything but the task at hand. His mind raced, mapping out the fastest route to the docking bay, while simultaneously calculating how many Clyrax troops might already be between them and their ship. Every corner they turned felt like stepping into a loaded trap. Another explosion roared from somewhere below, and the floor trembled violently. Arian staggered but recovered, the sharp tang of molten metal filling his nose as smoke began to seep into the corridor. A distant clatter of boots against steel told him what he already suspected. The Clyrax were closing in. "Arian!" Herrick said sharply, nodding toward a junction up ahead. Shadows danced in the dim light, the unmistakable shapes of armored figures moving toward them. "Ambush!" Arian muttered, ducking behind a broken storage crate. His fingers wrapped tightly around his sidearm, the cool grip grounding him in the chaos. "Stay low!" The Clyrax soldiers appeared moments later, their segmented armor gleaming faintly in the flickering light. They moved with a predatory grace, their weapons raised and scanning. Arian could feel the tension coiling in the air, thick and electric, as he waited for the right moment. One of the soldiers barked something in a guttural alien tongue, its voice harsh and clipped. The sound grated against Arian's ears, a sharp contrast to the muffled roar of distant chaos. He didn't need to understand the words to know they were searching for him. Arian's grip tightened on his weapon. Timing was everything. The soldiers moved closer, their boots striking a steady rhythm against the metal floor. He could hear the faint whirring of their targeting systems, the mechanical precision of death drawing nearer. Now Arian rose from cover, his sidearm spitting two sharp bursts of plasma. The first soldier dropped instantly, the shot piercing its chest armor with a flash of superheated metal. The second stumbled as Hyric's rifle barked behind him, the shot ripping through its knee joint and sending it sprawling. "Move!" Arian shouted, firing again to cover their retreat. The remaining soldiers scrambled for cover, returning fire with bursts of blue plasma that sizzled against the walls. The air crackled with energy, and the acrid bite of burning metal stung Arian's throat as he sprinted toward the docking bay. Hyric was close behind, his footsteps heavy but steady. "They're regrouping," he called out, glancing back to see the soldiers rising from their cover. "We won't outrun them if they bring reinforcements." "We don't need to outrun them," Arian replied. "We just need to get to the ship." The docking bay loomed ahead, its massive doors slightly ajar and leaking thin streams of light. Beyond them, the faint silhouettes of ships came into view, their hulking forms resting in the shadows like sleeping giants. Arian felt a flicker of hope, but it was short-lived. A low, mechanical growl rumbled from the shadows, and Arian's blood ran cold. Stepping into the light was a Clyrax war droid, its hulking frame bristling with weaponry. Its insect-like legs clattered against the floor as it moved, its crimson optical sensors locking onto Arian with unnerving precision. "Of course," Hyric muttered, raising his rifle. "It couldn't just be easy, could it?" Arian didn't answer. His mind was already working, analyzing the droid's movements and scanning the environment for anything that could be used to their advantage. The droid's weapons began to charge, a high-pitched whine building as its systems powered up. "Split up," Arian ordered. "Flank it from the sides." Hyric nodded, darting to the left as Arian moved right. The droid tracked their movements, its sensors flicking back and forth with a mechanical efficiency that made Arian's skin crawl. It opened fire, its plasma cannon unleashing a torrent of energy that tore through the floor where Hyric had been moments before. Arian fired at the droid's flank, his shots sparking harmlessly against its thick armor. He gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a solution. The docking bay was a maze of crates, cables, and machinery, and somewhere among it all had to be something they could use. "Keep it busy," Arian shouted, weaving between cover as the droid turned its attention toward him. Its plasma cannon fired again, the blast searing the air inches from his shoulder and leaving a molten scar on the wall behind him. "I'm trying," Hyric called back, his shots peppering the droid's legs in an attempt to slow it down. Arian's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that could give them an edge. His gaze landed on a stack of fuel canisters near the far wall, their bright red markings warning of highly volatile contents. "Hyric," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Those canisters. We can use them." Hyric glanced toward the stack, his expression grim. "You better hope this works." Arian nodded, moving into position as the droid's attention shifted back to him. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Hyric fired, his shot striking one of the canisters dead center. The resulting explosion was deafening, a fiery bloom that consumed the droid in a wave of heat and light. The force of the blast knocked Arion off his feet, his ears ringing as he hit the ground. The acrid bite of burning fuel filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of scorched metal. Arion pushed himself up, his vision swimming. The droid was down, its charred remains sparking faintly as it twitched in its final moments. Hyric appeared beside him, his face streaked with soot but otherwise unharmed. "Nice shot," Arion said, his voice hoarse. "Nice plan," Hyric replied, pulling him to his feet. "Now let's get the hell out of here." They sprinted toward their ship, the docking ramp lowering as they approached. The distant sounds of more Clyrax forces closing in spurred them on, each step a desperate push against the odds. As they boarded, Arion slapped the controls, the ramp hissing shut behind them. "Get us in the air!" he shouted, sliding into the co-pilot's seat as Hyric took the controls. The ship roared to life, its engines flaring as it lifted off the deck. Outside the viewport, the chaos of Caros station receded, its flames licking hungrily at the edges of the frame. Arion leaned back in his seat, his chest heaving. They had escaped, for now. But the Clyrax wouldn't stop, and neither could they. The next step was clear, but the cost of reaching it was only beginning to unfold. The ship streaked through the vast emptiness of space, the faint vibrations beneath Arion's boots, a reminder of how close they'd come to annihilation. He stood at the viewport, arms crossed, staring into the void where Caros Station now lay far behind. The faint glimmers of distant stars looked deceptively calm, their light indifferent to the fire and chaos that had just unfolded. Hyric's voice cut through the silence, sharp and weary. "We've got a problem." Arion turned, his expression hardening. "Just one?" Hyric didn't bother to smirk. He gestured to the flickering tactical display that filled the cockpit with an ominous red glow. "Clyrax interceptors. 2 ships, closing fast." Arion moved swiftly to the console, his fingers brushing over the controls as he brought up the tactical readout. The interceptors were sleek, angular craft designed for speed and precision. They moved like hunting birds, their trajectories angled to cut off any chance of escape. He could almost feel the predatory intent behind their approach, an invisible weight pressing against the back of his mind. "How long until they're in range?" Arion asked. 2 minutes, maybe less," Hyric replied, sliding into the pilot's seat. "They're running hot, and they've got us outgunned." Arion frowned, his mind racing. The interceptors wouldn't waste time on negotiation. They'd strike fast and clean, leaving no survivors. The only option was to outthink them. "Divert power to the aft shields," he ordered. "Angle them to absorb the first volley. We'll hit them head-on." Hyric glanced at him, one brow raised. "Head-on? That's your brilliant plan?" Arion's voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. "Trust me." Hyric muttered something under his breath, but obeyed, his fingers dancing across the console. The ship lurched slightly as the power redistribution took effect, the faint hum of the engines shifting to a deeper, more urgent vibration. "Hold steady," Arion said, his gaze fixed on the viewport. The interceptors were visible now, twin points of light growing steadily brighter as they approached. Every instinct screamed at him to veer away, to run, but he held his ground. The first volley came in a flash of blue, streaks of plasma arcing toward the ship with deadly precision. The shields absorbed the brunt of the impact, the energy dispersing in a cascade of sparks that lit up the cabin like fireworks. The ship shook violently, and the acrid tang of overheating systems stung Arion's nostrils. "They're not playing around!" Hyric shouted, gripping the controls tightly. "Neither are we," Arion shot back. "On my mark. Cut the engines and fire the maneuvering thrusters. We'll drift right under their noses." Hyric hesitated for only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Ready." "Now," Arion barked. The ship's engines went dark, and for a brief moment silence filled the cockpit. The maneuvering thrusters fired in sharp bursts, tilting the ship's nose upward as it glided on momentum. The interceptors roared past, their weapons blazing in confusion as their quarry seemed to vanish beneath them. Arion seized the moment. Redirect power to forward cannons. Target their engines. Hyric complied, and the ship's forward guns fired in rapid succession, each blast finding its mark. The first interceptor spun out of control, its engines erupting in a fiery explosion that sent debris scattering into the void. The second banked hard, attempting to regroup, but Arion was faster. "Cut them off," he said, his voice sharp with command. "Don't let them recover." Hyric swung the ship into position, and Arion fired again. The second interceptor erupted in a brilliant flash, its remains disappearing into the darkness. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Hyric leaned back in his seat, exhaling heavily. "Next time you come up with one of your crazy plans, remind me to object louder." Arion allowed himself a brief smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Noted. But the tension didn't leave him. The Clyrax weren't fools. If they'd sent interceptors, it meant they were already aware of his next destination. The galactic summit on Cordexus Prime was supposed to be a neutral ground, a place where representatives from across the galaxy could meet without fear of conflict. But neutrality was a fragile thing, and Arion knew better than to trust it. "We're not out of this yet," he said, his voice low. "Set course for Cordexus Prime, and keep the shields up. I don't trust anyone out here." Hyric nodded, his usual sarcasm replaced by grim determination. "You think they'll let us dock without trying to blow us out of the sky?" Arion's gaze hardened. "They'll let us dock. They won't want to risk making a scene. But once we're inside," he trailed off, his mind already turning over the possibilities. "The summit would be crawling with spies, mercenaries, and operatives from every major faction. Navigating it would require more than just diplomacy. It would require precision." The journey to Cordexus Prime was uneventful, but the tension in the cockpit remained palpable. The summit's approach was heralded by a massive structure coming into view, its spires reaching out like the arms of a giant, grasping at the stars. The station was illuminated by thousands of lights, a stark contrast to the dark void surrounding it. Ships of every shape and size orbited the station, their movements choreographed with military precision. "Impressive," Hyric said, his tone betraying a hint of unease, "and also a giant bullseye." Arion didn't respond. His attention was on the docking request he'd just sent, the response coming back almost immediately. They were cleared to dock at Bay 9. The message was terse, almost mechanical, but it was enough. As the ship settled into the docking bay, Arion rose from his seat, checking his sidearm and securing the data chip in an inner pocket. "Stay close," he said to Hyric, "and don't trust anyone." "Wasn't planning to," Hyric replied, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The docking ramp lowered, and the atmosphere of the summit hit them immediately. The air was cooler here, with a faint metallic bite that spoke of relentless filtration. The sounds of the summit were a cacophony of voices, the sharp clicks and guttural tones of alien languages, blending with the hum of machinery and the occasional bark of orders. Arion's eyes scanned the crowd as they stepped into the main atrium, a sprawling space filled with representatives from every corner of the galaxy. The tension was almost tangible, an undercurrent of suspicion and hostility lurking beneath the surface. He could feel the weight of countless eyes on him, each one assessing, calculating. "This is a powder keg waiting to blow," Hyric muttered, his gaze flicking toward a group of heavily armed guards near the far wall. "Then we'll make sure we're the ones holding the match," Arion replied, his voice low. The atrium's lights flickered briefly, drawing a murmur from the crowd. Arion's hand instinctively moved to his weapon, but the moment passed without incident. Still, it was a reminder of how precarious their situation was. As they moved deeper into the summit, Arion's mind churned with possibilities. Somewhere in this maze of politics and power plays was the answer he needed, the key to turning the tide against the Clyrax. But finding it would be like navigating a minefield, every step fraught with danger. His jaw tightened as he caught sight of a familiar figure in the crowd, a shadow from his past that he hadn't expected to see here. The figure turned, their eyes locking onto Arion with a mixture of surprise and cold calculation. "Well," the figure said, their voice carrying just enough venom to cut through the noise, "I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to show your face here." The crowd shifted like a restless tide around Arian as he stared down the figure from his past. For a moment, the noise of the atrium, the layered din of alien languages, mechanical whirs, and the rhythmic clatter of boots, dulled to a faint murmur in his mind. All he saw was the man in front of him, Malric Vael. Once an ally, now something far more dangerous. "Still carrying that signature flair for dramatics, Arian," Malric said, stepping closer, his voice smooth and laced with venom. His sharp, angular features were illuminated by the cold light of the summit, making his calculating gaze all the more piercing. "You must be desperate if you've come here." "Desperation's a funny thing," Arian replied, his tone clipped but steady. "Makes people dangerous. You should know." Malric smirked, the kind of expression that didn't reach his eyes. "And yet, you're the one walking into the Viper's den uninvited." "Save the posturing," Arian said sharply. "You wouldn't have come to Cordexus if you didn't want something. Question is, how far are you willing to go to get it?" Malric's smirk faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Arian filed the reaction away in the back of his mind. Whatever Malric wanted, it wasn't entirely within his grasp yet, and that meant leverage. Before either of them could speak again, Hyric cleared his throat, stepping slightly forward. "I hate to interrupt this little reunion," he said, his rifle angled just enough to be a silent warning. "But we've got bigger problems than old grudges." Malric's gaze flicked to Hyric, sizing him up in a heartbeat. "Still collecting strays, I see." "Better than collecting enemies," Arian said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Now, are you going to help me, or are we doing this the hard way?" Malric chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "I'd love to see your idea of the hard way. But for now—" He tilted his head toward a side corridor, gesturing for them to follow. "Let's talk somewhere less public." Arian didn't hesitate, though his hand stayed close to his weapon as they moved. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, the air cool and faintly metallic, carrying with it the hum of distant machinery. Their footsteps echoed off the walls, a rhythmic reminder of how precarious this meeting was. "You've got a way of showing up when things are about to fall apart," Malric said, as they reached a small chamber tucked away from the main thoroughfares. The room was stark and utilitarian, its walls lined with storage crates and monitoring equipment. A single console flickered in the corner, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the space. "Maybe if you were better at holding things together, I wouldn't have to," Arian shot back, leaning against one of the crates. "But let's skip the pleasantries. What do you know about the Clyrax's movements?" Malric crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "The Clyrax aren't moving. They're consolidating." Arian's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "They've been gathering their forces on the edge of neutral space," Malric said, his voice low and deliberate. "Not just their warships, logistics, supply chains, everything. They're not just preparing for war, they're building something." Arian felt the words land like a blow, the weight of them settling in his chest. "Building what?" "That," Malric said, stepping closer, his tone edged with frustration, "is the part I can't figure out. Whatever it is, it's big. Bigger than anything they've attempted before. And it's tied to Earth." The mention of Earth sent a ripple of tension through the room. Hyric shifted uneasily, his hand tightening on his weapon. "Why Earth?" he asked. "What do they want with us?" Malric shrugged, though his expression remained grim. "Your guess is as good as mine. But I've heard whispers about genetic experiments. Something about perfection." Arian's stomach turned at the thought. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they painted was grim. The Clyrax didn't just see Earth as a target. They saw it as a resource, a foundation for something monstrous. "We need to move fast," Arian said, his voice firm. "If they're consolidating, it means they're getting ready to strike. We can't give them the chance." Malric raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to stop them? You've got what? A ship and a handful of weapons? Against an entire armada?" "We'll find a way," Arian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We always do." Malric studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're as infuriatingly stubborn as ever. Fine. I'll help, but you owe me for this. Add it to the list, Arian said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Before Malric could respond, the console in the corner beeped loudly, its screen flashing with an incoming transmission. Malric moved quickly, his fingers flying across the controls as he pulled up the message. His expression darkened as he read the data. "We've got company," he said, his voice tight. "Clyrax operatives. They're already on the station." Arian's heart rate spiked, though his voice remained calm. "How many?" "Enough to make things interesting," Malric replied. "They're sweeping the docking bays. If they find your ship, this little rebellion of yours is over before it starts." Arian didn't hesitate. "Then we make sure they don't." Malric smirked, though there was no humor in it. Still diving headfirst into impossible situations, some things never change. Arian ignored the jab, turning to Hirik. "Secure the ship. Make sure we're ready to leave at a moment's notice." "What about you?" Hirik asked, his voice edged with concern. "I'll handle the operatives," Arian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Malric, you're coming with me." Malric raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. "This should be fun." The trio moved swiftly through the station, their footsteps muffled against the reinforced flooring. The air was heavy with anticipation, the distant sounds of movement and conversation, a constant reminder of how close the Clyrax operatives were. Every turn of the corridor felt like stepping into a trap, the tension building with each passing moment. As they neared the docking bays, Arian signaled for them to stop. He crouched low, peering around the corner to see a group of Clyrax soldiers patrolling the area. Their armor gleamed under the harsh lights, and their movements were sharp and precise, like predators stalking their prey. "We need to draw them away," Arian whispered, his voice barely audible. "Malric, you're up." Malric smirked, his expression one of grudging respect. Always the strategist. He moved quickly, darting down a side corridor and disappearing from sight. Moments later, the sound of a distant explosion echoed through the station, followed by shouts and the clatter of boots. The soldiers immediately moved toward the commotion, leaving the docking bay unguarded. Arian and Hirik slipped through the shadows, their movements silent and precise. The ship was just ahead, its sleek form a beacon of hope amid the chaos. But as they approached, Arian felt a chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. "Hirik," he said softly, his eyes scanning the area. "Stay sharp." The words had barely left his mouth when a figure stepped out of the shadows, a Clyrax officer with a cruel smile and a blade that gleamed like liquid silver. "Well," the officer said, his voice low and dangerous. "Looks like I found the prize." The Clyrax officer's blade caught the light, its polished edge reflecting a fractured glow that seemed alive with malice. He moved with eerie precision, his gait deliberate, his expression cold and predatory. Arian's fingers itched toward his sidearm, but he didn't draw. Not yet. "Well," the officer said, his voice smooth and venomous. "The infamous Arian Drace. I thought you'd be taller." Arian met his gaze without flinching. "And I thought the Clyrax were smarter. Guess we're both disappointed." The officer smirked, unfazed by the retort. His eyes flicked toward Hirik, then back to Arian. "Surrender now, and I might let your friend live. Resist, and I'll make sure he dies first." The tension in the air was suffocating, thick with the anticipation of violence. Arian's mind raced, calculating angles, assessing the officer's stance, the positioning of his troops just beyond the docking bay. They couldn't afford a prolonged fight. Not here, not now. "Tempting," Arian said, his tone laced with mockery. "But I've got a counteroffer." Without warning, he shifted his weight and drew his sidearm in one fluid motion, firing a single, precise shot. The plasma bolt struck the officer's blade, shattering it in a burst of sparks. The Clyrax staggered back, his smug composure replaced by a snarl of rage. "Move!" Arian barked, grabbing Hirik's arm and pulling him toward the ship. The docking bay erupted into chaos. Clyrax troops surged forward, their boots pounding against the floor as they opened fire. Plasma blasts streaked through the air, their heat searing Arian's skin as he ducked behind a stack of crates. The sharp tang of scorched metal filled the bay, mingling with the acrid smoke rising from smoldering debris. Hyric returned fire, his rifle roaring with rapid bursts that sent the nearest soldiers diving for cover. "We're pinned!" he shouted, his voice tight with adrenaline. "Not for long," Arian replied, his mind already formulating a plan. He activated his wrist module, pulling up a schematic of the docking bay. The layout was a labyrinth of storage containers, fueling lines, and maintenance equipment. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Fuel lines," Arian said, pointing to a cluster of pipes running along the far wall. "We can blow them, create a chain reaction. It'll give us enough chaos to escape." Hyric nodded, his face grim but resolute. "You better be right about this." "I'm always right," Arian shot back, though the edge of tension in his voice betrayed him. He darted toward the pipes, keeping low as plasma fire streaked overhead. The heat from the blasts rippled through the air, singeing the edges of his jacket. His pulse thundered in his ears, each step a calculated gamble against the storm of chaos around him. Reaching the pipes, Arian pulled a small charge from his belt, its surface glinting faintly in the flickering light. His fingers worked quickly, attaching it to the base of the central line. The adhesive stuck with a faint hiss, the sound almost lost amid the cacophony of the firefight. 30 seconds, he called to Hyric, who was laying down suppressing fire with practiced precision. "We need to move, now!" Hyric nodded, retreating toward the ship as Arian followed. The charge detonated behind them, a deafening explosion that sent a wave of heat and force rolling through the bay. The fuel lines ignited in a cascading series of blasts, each one brighter and more intense than the last. The air was alive with the roar of fire, the screech of tearing metal, and the panicked shouts of Clyrac's troops scrambling for cover. The chaos bought them the precious seconds they needed. Arian and Hyric sprinted up the ramp of their ship, the docking bay a blazing inferno behind them. The ramp sealed shut with a hiss, and the ship's systems roared to life, the vibrations of its engines rumbling through the deck. "Punch it," Arian ordered, sliding into the co-pilot's seat. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled faintly as he keyed in the navigational coordinates. The adrenaline was still coursing through him, leaving him acutely aware of every sound, every movement. Hyric didn't hesitate. The ship lifted off the deck, the inertial dampeners groaning under the strain of the sudden acceleration. Outside the viewport, the docking bay receded rapidly, its flames reduced to a distant glow against the darkness of space. But the Clyracs weren't done. Sensors lit up with warning indicators as a trio of Clyrax interceptors broke away from the station, their sleek forms cutting through the void with predatory grace. Their weapon systems powered up, the faint glow of plasma cannons charging visible even from this distance. "Interceptors incoming," Hyric said, his voice tight. "They're faster than us." "Then we even the playing field," Arian replied, his fingers flying over the console. "Deploy countermeasures and bring up the decoy signature." Hyric glanced at him, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "You really think that'll work?" "It doesn't have to work," Arian said, his tone clipped. "It just has to buy us time." The ship's countermeasures deployed with a sudden burst, releasing a cloud of reflective particles that scattered the Interceptor's targeting systems. At the same time, the decoy signature activated, projecting the illusion of a second ship breaking away in the opposite direction. The Interceptors hesitated, their formation fracturing as they split to pursue both targets. Arian felt a surge of grim satisfaction, though he knew it wouldn't last. "Set course for the jump point," he said. "We've got one shot at this." Hyric nodded, his hands steady on the controls as he angled the ship toward the designated coordinates. The Interceptors regrouped quickly, their weapons firing in synchronized volleys that lit up the void with streaks of blue light. Arian gritted his teeth, his grip on the console tightening as the ship shuddered under the impacts. "Hold it together," he muttered, more to himself than to Hyric. The jump point loomed ahead, a swirling vortex of energy that marked the edge of the system. It was a calculated risk. Jumping while under fire could destabilize the ship's systems, but staying meant certain death. "Now or never," Hyric said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Do it," Arian replied. The ship surged forward, its engines screaming as it pushed past their limits. The vortex grew larger, its energy crackling like a storm about to break. Plasma fire rained down around them, each impact a reminder of how close they were to failure. Then, with a sudden lurch, the ship crossed the threshold. The stars blurred into streaks of light, and the Clyrax interceptors vanished from view. The jump drive engaged, propelling them into the safety of hyperspace. Arian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the tension in his chest easing slightly. But the relief was short-lived. The Clyrax were relentless, and this victory was only a temporary reprieve. As the ship stabilized, Hyric turned to him, his expression equal parts exhaustion and curiosity. What now? Arian leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on the swirling expanse of hyperspace outside the viewport. We find out what the Clyrax are building, and we stop them. The words hung heavy in the air. A promise and a challenge rolled into one. The stakes were rising, and Arian knew the next move would determine everything. The ship emerged from hyperspace into the desolate expanse of the Nithyrus system. Before them loomed the Clyrax construct, an immense, sprawling megastructure that dwarfed even the largest of space stations. Its skeletal framework pulsed faintly, lit from within by an eerie golden energy that twisted and coiled like a living thing. From this distance it looked incomplete, a machine still assembling itself, but its purpose was unmistakable. It was a factory of transformation. Arian leaned forward in the cockpit, his expression a grim mask. "There it is," he said, his voice devoid of the usual edge of sarcasm. "The center of their plan." Hyric stared at the construct, his face pale under the flickering light of the ship's monitors. "That thing's massive," he muttered, gripping the edge of his console. "And it's not just a base. It's a breeding ground," Arian finished, his voice tight. "They're harvesting Earth's genetic diversity, splicing it into something they think will make them unstoppable." Hyric cursed under his breath. "This is bigger than just Earth. If they perfect this thing, they'll reshape the entire galaxy." Arian didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the construct, his mind already spinning through strategies, risks, and sacrifices. Every second counted now, and hesitation wasn't an option. "We take it out," he said finally, his voice steady. "We find their control hub, disable the core, and bring the whole thing crashing down." Hyric's laugh was short and humorless. "Just like that, huh? You've got a plan for infiltrating the most heavily guarded structure I've ever seen?" Arian turned to him, his gaze sharp. "We've been improvising since the start. Why stop now?" Hyric shook his head, but didn't argue. "Fine, but we're going to need a diversion. Something to keep their fleet off us long enough to get inside." Arian tapped the console, bringing up a schematic of the construct's surrounding defenses. Clyrax ships patrolled the perimeter in tight, calculated patterns, their movements designed to leave no gaps. It was a fortress, and one misstep would end them. "Overload their sensor grid," Arian said, pointing to a cluster of satellites orbiting the construct. "It'll blind them for a few minutes, just long enough for us to slip through. After that—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "We'll figure it out." Hyric gave him a long look, then nodded. "Let's make it count." The ship approached the perimeter under the cover of its cloaking field, the silence in the cockpit heavy with anticipation. Arian's fingers moved deftly over the controls, his focus unshakable as he initiated the overload sequence. The satellites flared one by one, their systems cascading into failure in a chain reaction of sparking energy. "We're in," Hyric said, his voice low, "but they'll notice soon." "They always do," Arian replied. The ship slipped through the weakened defenses, weaving between the sprawling arms of the construct. Up close, the scale was overwhelming. Vast corridors of scaffolding and machinery stretched endlessly in every direction, their surfaces crawling with Clyrax drones. The golden energy pulsing through the structure cast shifting patterns of light and shadow, giving the entire place an unsettling, almost organic feel. Arian guided the ship toward a docking port, its outer gates yawning open as though inviting them in. The moment they touched down, he was on his feet, strapping on his sidearm and grabbing the pack of explosives they'd salvaged from Caros. "Keep the ship prepped for a quick getaway," he told Hyric. "If this goes sideways, We don't wait. Hyric snorted. When has it ever not gone sideways? Arian didn't answer. He stepped out of the ship, the docking bay's cold air hitting him like a slap. It was sterile and heavy, carrying the faint hum of machinery that reverberated through the walls like a heartbeat. He moved quickly, his footsteps echoing against the metal floor as he made his way deeper into the structure. The corridors were vast and labyrinthine, their walls lined with glowing conduits that pulsed in rhythmic waves. The sound of distant voices, low, guttural Clyrax commands, echoed faintly, growing louder as he approached a central chamber. He slowed, pressing himself against a shadowed alcove as two Clyrax guards passed, their angular forms silhouetted against the light. Arian waited until their footsteps faded, then slipped into the chamber. It was massive, its ceiling lost in darkness and its walls covered in intricate alien glyphs that pulsed with the same golden energy. At the center of the room was the core, a towering cylindrical device that throbbed with power. It was surrounded by control panels, each manned by Clyrax engineers who worked with mechanical precision. Arian's breath caught for a moment. This was it, the heart of their operation. He moved silently, his steps precise as he skirted the edges of the chamber. The explosives in his pack felt heavier with every step, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. He reached the base of the core, crouching low as he began planting the charges. His hands moved quickly, his fingers steady despite the hammering of his pulse. A voice rang out behind him, sharp and commanding. "Don't move!" Arian froze. The Clyrax officer from the docking bay stepped into view, his weapon leveled at Arian's chest. His cruel smile was back, his eyes glinting with triumph. "You've come a long way to die here, human," the officer said, his tone dripping with mockery. Arian's mind raced, searching for an opening. "And you've gone to a lot of trouble for something you'll never finish," he replied, his voice calm despite the tension. The officer's smile widened. "We'll see about that." Arian's hand moved imperceptibly, his fingers brushing against the detonator on his belt. He'd only have one chance. The officer stepped closer, his weapon unwavering. "You think your kind is special," the Clyrax said, his tone cold. "Weak, fragile things, clinging to a dying world, but we've seen your potential. You could be perfect." "Perfect's overrated," Arian said sharply. In one swift motion, he activated the detonator and lunged to the side. The charges detonated in a blinding explosion, the shockwave tearing through the chamber and sending the core into a catastrophic meltdown. The Clyrax officer was thrown backward, his screams lost in the roar of the explosion. Arian hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The chamber was collapsing around him, the golden energy spiraling out of control as the core overloaded. He pushed himself to his feet, his vision swimming as he stumbled toward the exit. "Hyric!" he gasped into his comm. "Get the ship ready, I'm coming in hot." The corridors were chaos, the structure groaning and shuddering as the explosion rippled outward. Arian ran, his legs burning with the effort, his lungs searing with every breath. The docking bay came into view just as another explosion tore through the structure, the force of it nearly knocking him off his feet. The ship's ramp was open, and Hyric was waiting, his expression grim. "You look terrible," he said, grabbing Arian's arm and pulling him aboard. "Feel worse," Arian replied, collapsing into a seat as the ship lifted off. They cleared the construct just as it collapsed, the golden energy imploding in a final blinding flash. Arian watched from the viewport, his expression unreadable as the structure disappeared into the void. Hyric glanced at him. "You did it." Arian leaned back, exhaustion washing over him. "We did it." The ship sped away, leaving the wreckage behind. Earth was safe for now. But Arian knew the fight wasn't over. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, and they'd just been reminded why that was a mistake. As the stars stretched before them, Arian allowed himself a small, fleeting smile. Humanity wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was enough to be human.